Welcome everybody to a very special event on a Wednesday for a change. Welcome to our tasting with a blender from Midleton Distillery, Redbreast blender. Dave McCabe is going to be joining us in a minute. You're all very welcome. Thanks for tuning in. What else would we be doing on a Wednesday night? It seems like weekdays and weekends just blur together into one long, monotonous day, broken up occasionally by the pouring of some whiskey. So you're all very welcome. Thank you for tuning in on a Wednesday. I'm excited for tonight. It's not every day we get to have a chat with the makers of the whiskies that we enjoy and that we love. So I'll be bringing Dave in just a second. For those of you who have questions about Redbreast small batch or anything to do with Redbreast, feel free to post your questions in the chat at any time during the evening. We're broadcasting live on Facebook and on YouTube and across Twitter. So feel free to put your questions in there and we'll get to as many questions as we possibly can. I know we have a big contingent joining us from Ohio, so you're all very welcome. Ohio has been cleaning the shelves of this fine whiskey over the past few weeks, and everyone's excited to hear more about it. So you didn't come here to listen to me. You came here to sip on some Redbreast and listen to somebody far more interesting. So without further ado, let me bring in Dave McCabe, all the way live from the Midleton Distillery. Dave, welcome.
Hi, Barry. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us. Thrilled that you were able to join us tonight. I know we're cutting into your night time. You know, it's very late in Ireland, and you're a gentleman in saying, not only will I join you, I'll join you from the distillery.
Yeah, well, I actually only live across the road, so and the Wi-Fi is 10 times better here, so it just made more sense to pop over and work from here. So no problem at all.
Any excuse to come back to the distillery?
Pretty much.
Dave, we're going to sip in a little bit on this newest release for the US market, the Redbreast small batch. I'm excited to hear your notes and hear the story behind it and the process behind it. Many of our audience, especially our US audience, will not have had the pleasure perhaps of meeting you, of listening to you and hearing from you before. I wonder, could you help us understand your own role in the distillery and how you arrived at the role you're in now?
Yeah, sure. So I started out with Irish Distillers back in 2010, around this time actually, that time of year, and started in the visitor centre side. And during that time there, I helped set up what's called the Irish Whiskey Academy a few years after that. And that involved, I suppose, teaching people everything about whiskey production, from the raw materials to the finished product. And that involved, traveling and going to events and meeting yourself probably in the past life. And during that time, going to events and things like that and organizing certain classes with kind of blending exercise and things. I got to know Billy Lighton, who's my now boss, head blender at Midleton. And I suppose we struck up a good relationship. And a few years later, he came to me just, inquiring would I be interested in an apprentice type role with himself back in 2016. So I started with him then in 2017, working under him, just learning everything there is to know about everything to do with blending, not just the actual mixing of whiskies, but the managing of stock, forecasting sales, making sure we've enough, barrels coming in that are filled with the right spirits for everything that we make for the next, 30, 40 years. So it was a huge learning curve for me, and still learning today, but it's been great. So I've been blending now since 2017, alongside Billy.
The word blender doesn't do justice to the scope of the role, does it? Like you mentioned, the planning, the inventory management, in addition to the blending, a lot to it.
There is, just to give you a few examples, when we talk about Redbreast, and, one of the key contributors to making Redbreast are our sherry casks, which come from Spain. So when we're ordering them, we actually have to order them 4 years in advance of when we expect to fill them, because that's how long it takes the casks to be made, because the oak has to be sourced. It then takes about 18 months to dry out in the cooperage in Spain. And then when it's turned into a cask, it's seasoned with wine for 2 more years on top of that. So when you look at Redbreast 12, we're looking at 16 years time, what we expect we need to be filling sherry casks with in volume to then order with the guys in Spain this year. So they'll arrive 4 years after the order. We fill them for 12 years. And that's when you start seeing it come out for Redbreast 12. So that's one element of blending as well, which is just forward looking and planning.
Is that why people who work at Midleton have such long careers? That the project timelines themselves are so long, they have to see the projects through.
Yes, for sure, definitely. So when we're doing Redbreast 27, the length of time involved in filling casks for that,
So born in Cork, working under Billy Lighton, now blender at the Midleton Distillery, and now your name on the side of a bottle. My question to you would be, where did it all go wrong?
I keep asking myself that every day as well.
Living across the road from the distillery and all. You have it all made now.
This is pretty much it. Just once I don't mess up anything from the blending side, if they'll keep me on,
How has the last year affected life at the distillery?
It's been a big change, and obviously it's been a huge change for everyone, not just in the distillery, but everyone and their families, both here and around the world. And I suppose, we have to keep going. And the idea here for us is that, people who can work from home, because with technology these days, everything's done via Teams or Zoom and things like that. So those who can work from home do so. And those of us who can come in because we need to, in terms of doing our job. So it's very quiet around the office. On my floor now, there'll just be a handful of people compared to how it was long ago. So it's impacted everyone, but we're still able to work away and keep the spirits up as much as we can. So being busy, I think, is probably a good thing this during this time as well. So just keep on tipping away, as they say.
Well, the whiskey keeps getting consumed anyway in fairly large quantities, and Redbreast is a particular brand worth noting, isn't it? I mean, 40% growth in the last 52 weeks, which is in the US, which is insane growth for a brand, which I suppose it wouldn't have had that international recognition even when you started working on it, would it?
No, not at all. It would have been obviously big here in Ireland, France, and the UK, and maybe Germany as well. And when I kind of would have started, and it would have been just the core, 12, and then the 15 came out kind of a few years later, and we've been expanding ever since with the likes of the Lustow, the 21, the 27, and the cask strength. So it's been a huge journey for the Redbreast brand in terms of the extensions from the 12 that we would have been mostly familiar with, and particularly, as you said, in the States, it's getting huge amount of, I suppose, notoriety and a lot of talk around it. And I think that's credit to obviously the whiskey itself, but there's a lot of work on the ground in the States by the likes of you might know Dominic Venegas over in California, who I must say to him and Gemma Cole, congratulations, because they just had a baby girl, Isla Grace, on Sunday.
Yeah, congratulations.
So I hope they're doing well. But it's the likes of Dominic and Alex Thibault and other people in the States who do a lot of work promoting Redbreast on the ground, and it gets people talking as well. So I suppose a lot of factors that have helped Redbreast, but for us, it's just a kind of a powerhouse of a single pot still. That the messaging around Redbreast back in the day was just for those in the know. But I think there's been a change to say, well, for those who don't know, they should know. So it's getting a bit more publicity from that point of view as well. So we're delighted. It's a great product, and it keeps, again, as I was saying, keeps us busy, because during this time now when things quieten down around us, we're flat out making Redbreast and working on new expressions like the latest release for the US as well.
It's not just the priests that are drinking it anymore, so.
No, it's a wider stretch now than that now, thankfully.
Nuns and everything now. We've expanded widely, dramatically. So you mentioned extensions, and like the 12-year-old, the iconic 12-year-old, is that one that has been there almost continuously for many years, let's say. There's a backbone, isn't there, to the Redbreast lineup? Like there's a DNA. What is that common kind of DNA that carries through every whiskey that's released?
It's a very good question, and that's one of the hard parts with blending, is to maintain a consistency in all the expressions where you can see a crossover, but then you have to do slight tweaks to your formulations to showcase certain flavors that would be accentuated within that range, and that's what gives each Redbreast style its own personality. But when you look at the defining style, it's brought down to three things, I suppose, really. One would be your distillate types that we produce in our pot stills. The second would be the use of our oak casks, and the third then is the time that those two are left mature. So when you think of Midleton here, we have our copper pot stills, which we're using malted and unmalted barley in our mash bill. But we make three different variations of pot still distillate, which we call kind of internally ourselves kind of light, medium, and kind of a traditional heavy style. And depending on the brands that you're making, some brands might only be made of one distillate type and maybe aged in one type of barrel, or maybe two. And then other brands, you could have two types of distillates married together after aging, or even three. So where Redbreast falls in there is it's the main, I suppose, majority of the brands of Redbreast or styles of Redbreast we make would consist of two distillate types, which we call the kind of the light and the medium styles. We call them light and medium in terms of, pot still spice intensity to a degree, but, the fruit element as well would be two kind of factors that would distinguish those from each other. And then when you're going into the likes of the Redbreast 21 and the 27, we introduce then that more traditional, heavier style of pot still to those, but it still has those other two distillates within it as well. So that's how you can kind of peak certain elements in other ranges of the Redbreast family. Then when you look at the cask types, we're using ex-bourbon and ex-sherry wine casks. And again, when you're using barrels to age whiskey, if they're barrels which you're using for the first time, we call them first fill. If you're using them for a second and third time, then again, they're second and third, but the influence of the oak will diminish with each use. So for the likes of Redbreast 12 and the cask strength, we'll be using all first fill barrels, both bourbon and sherry. So what we're trying to do there for the Redbreast 12 is emphasize a lot of the oak characteristics that you find in it and intensify possibly the sherry style by including a good percentage of sherry cask whiskey in that formulation. But if we want to peel that back slightly, you'll find that then in the Redbreast 15, where we introduce a smaller percentage of second fill bourbon and second fill sherry, but we leave the whiskey age that bit longer, minimum 15 up to 19 years. So you can see where Redbreast 15 differs from the 12. It still carries the same distillate types, a little bit longer, still first fill, second fill bourbon sherry, but now an additional second or first fill bourbon and sherry, second fill bourbon sherry now as well. So the wood is slightly peeled back, allowing the distillate slightly shine through a bit more. So that's where that kind of veers off. When you look at the 21 and the 27, as I said, you're introducing a new distillate type. And what helps there with the flavors, it kind of drives up this kind of exotic fruit characteristic that you mightn't necessarily get in the other styles. And then where 27 differs, very fine. We try to not go too far off the beaten track of Redbreast, but we introduce some port barrels to that one, which drives up that kind of exotic fruits to more kind of fleshy stone fruits as well. So I suppose without kind of rambling on too much, my point is you take your distillates and your wood type, and if you keep them slightly, the main body of each of your formula, then peel back the oak slightly, you're getting your 15, and if you add certain casks like port pipes and leave it longer, that's your 27. But the core range is always your two types of distillates and bourbon and sherry, with the sherry being quite influential throughout most of the range, I suppose you could say.
You shared something very profound when I saw you last in Boston, when you were over a year and a half or 2 years ago now at this stage. And it was a perspective I'd never thought of. And it, to this day, is one of the most profound things I think about when it comes to Irish whiskey. And I'm giving you full credit for this. But we were talking about how much time in the year is devoted to distilling certain brands. And you shared that this immortal line, I think it was the most poetic line I've ever heard when it comes to Irish whiskey, which was, when the whiskey is distilled, it doesn't yet know what it's going to be. And I thought, mind blown. Like, that is what an amazing observation that the spirit doesn't know yet what it's going to be. And that's all down to what casks and the time in the casks and the recasking and et cetera, et cetera. But you don't distill Redbreast. You distill a style of pot still that eventually becomes Redbreast. And that was a game-changing knowledge moment for me, which I think you just put so eloquently.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Whiskey in a barrel is a living thing, and as it's aging and developing its personality and the character, if it's not going to be picked at a certain age or a certain flavor profile, it gets moved on again. So it falls out of the possibility of becoming something like a Redbreast and could move into something else like a Midleton, or, because it's constantly changing and evolving. And if you don't use it at the optimum for that particular brand, then it's, going to be in another, I suppose, potential parcel of casks for another brand. So when we fill them day one, we don't put these 50 barrels aside, in day one, saying they're going to be Redbreast in 12 years. They're just with all their friends, basically. And when the time is right, we'll either take them or we'll let them age on. Or we might take them younger and use them for something else. An example would be, there's a good sherry contribution of whiskey in Jameson Black Barrel. But we want to emphasize a sweet element in Black Barrel as well. So if you pull whiskies out of their casks by maybe 8-9 years of age, you might have reached that optimum sweetness at that point. But if you let them age on, that's where you're developing, additional flavors or, other complexities to the flavor, which would merit or bode very well then for the likes of Redbreast 12, for example.
Would you find much variance within a batch once the spirit is put in the casks, and after a number of years, you're hoping that maybe that batch of casks gets to 9-10 years, but would you find that not all wood is equal and some casks will mature at different rates? Yeah,
you'd find that even with two barrels sitting next to each other, for 12 years, that they'll be different when you look at them side by side. It's very interesting from that point of view, because we would screen every cask before it goes to be used for the likes of Redbreast 12 or any of the brands, any of the range. So, there could be, say, 30 sherry casks in a batch of Redbreast, and Will knows every single one of those sherry casks, and they're all filled the same day into the same type of cask in the same warehouse. So they've, been through all the same years and seasons and changes in weather and everything, and they'll still be different. What we'd call a variation from cask to cask. Now, you're not too concerned about that. You'll find some amazing kind of one-off exquisite whiskey sometimes from them, and what we might do is put them aside and say, look, we won't include them in the batch because that uniqueness will be lost. But then when you get slight variation from cask to cask, when you marry them all together, you'll get a kind of averaging out effect of a sherry influence. So while some could be more dried fruit driven, others are a bit more kind of nutty character, and some have maybe higher levels of vanilla coming through. They're all from the sherry cask, but you'll find that their influence is varying from barrel to barrel. So when you marry them together, you'll get this uniformed kind of sherry influence. So you do find variability even in the same parcel, but when you marry them, that's where you get your consistency then.
Well, it's just such a fascinating job to begin with. But when you think about the scale of Midleton and the variation then at that scale, it's got to make for complexities and surprises and some sadness along the way. Like, it's surely a roller coaster of emotion depending on what you find.
It is. And I suppose the hardest part is, you can only make whiskey with what you have. So, if sales go up, you can't exactly make more 12-year-old whiskey tomorrow. So that's the complexities where you say, well, if we want to make more Redbreast in 5 years' time, what 7-year-old whiskies that are used in brands now have to be kept back for them? So that will impact other brands as well. So there's a lot of calculations, and your mind will be quite spent at the end of the day sometimes trying to work all that out, because with forecasts, they always change as well. But what's great then is when you do the smaller little projects like, the small batch that we have this evening, there's a huge amount of work that goes into them, even if it's a one-off edition, and that's as interesting as anything else that we do as well.
There's loads of questions about the batches and about the differences between the barrels and casks and how they get used, and what's the difference between 12 cask strength and now the small batch. And we'll come to some of those questions later. But I want to come back to get us closer to this small batch tasting. 2019, Redbreast rewarded America with its own small batches, and you had 4 different releases. Then you had the 4 small batches, A, B, C, and D, and those tended to focus on the different components of what made up Redbreast, didn't they? In terms of like, it became a kind of almost like a dissection of the Redbreast brand, of Redbreast 12-year-old, I think more specifically, or closer to it. What did the small batch, this new small batch then, what was the goal with this one in terms of, did you have something in mind of what you wanted to achieve prior to releasing it?
Yeah, I mean, when we were first approached to do the first offering for the States, we really wanted to kind of do something that was unusual and unique. And as it was specifically for the States, we wanted to make it as interesting as we could at the same time. Because Redbreast wouldn't have been, again, it's still growing, but still might be very unfamiliar in a lot of areas in the States as well. So it was good to show people different styles of Redbreast within one kind of sitting. So we made 4 expressions of Redbreast for that first release, but they all came from the same 4 components or kind of ingredients, you could say, to make them. So we called them, internally called them, as you know, A, B, C, and D. So we're using 2 types of spirit in bourbon and 2 types of spirit in sherry. And 3 of them consisted of all 4 elements, but we would increase the use of sherry in one of them, brought it down in another, emphasized the age and the bourbon influence in the third, and then in the fourth we would have used 3 of those 4 distillates, and it was slightly older. So it was showcasing, well, here's the Redbreast style, but this one is particularly more oak driven. This is slightly more spicy driven. This is maybe sweeter, and this just has a bit more of a kind of an extra layer of flavor due to the inclusion of that 4th barrel. So that was the original first batch that we did. So again, for this offering, we wanted to do something different, but again, not a million miles away from the core expressions of Redbreast. And it was actually chatting to Billy to give him his credit, because I'm going to use his quote here. But this batch kind of falls between on the shelf where you would sit your Redbreast Lustau and your Redbreast 12 cask strength. So it's kind of where if you're lining them all up together, this is where this particular batch would fall in between, which I think is an interesting way of putting it, because that's exactly what it does. We're touching upon a sherry influence, but we're not going too far on the sherry, and then leaving a cask strength, which is what you get in the Redbreast 12, but slightly younger at the same time. So it's, it's kind of, I don't want to say it's more of the same, but it's very important that we don't want to create out of this world different style of whiskey and still call it Redbreast, because that wouldn't be true to the brand. So it's just kind of a tip to the cap of how Redbreast is, and this is just another expression of that, essentially.
We were chatting before we went live, and I mentioned to you that, as I was taking my notes last night, sipping on this, the first thing I wrote down was, this tastes to me like a Redbreast Lustau at cask strength. And it's interesting that you point out that that's kind of where it lives close to that. It seems to follow the same process in terms of the vatting and the kind of the recasking, does it, as a Lustau? Could you walk us through how this then is produced differently, perhaps to that 12 cask strength that we'd be more familiar with?
Yeah, so if we look at, say, Lustau, first of all, well, look at 12 cask strength, first of all. That's probably the easiest one to explain. That is your Redbreast 12-year-old formulation, but it's left at its natural cask strength. And we make that, usually once a year, sometimes twice, depending on the requirements from the bottling hall. So when we're doing a batch of that, it could be, say, 60, 65 casks one year. It could be up to 70 another year, 90 another year, and down to, 50 again the following year. So every batch will still be the same formulation in terms of bourbon casks, sherry, and the same age. But depending on the volume requirements, that's where it slightly differs. So that's where you find subtle, nuanced differences from batch to batch of the cask strength. And you'll see that the strength also changes slightly as well. I have one here in front of me, and it's 55.8. I know there was a 57.7 at one stage as well, so it does change slightly, but it is the Redbreast 12 whiskey, but just left at its natural strength. Where Lustau differs then is it's slightly younger. We would typically, now we used to, it's gone a bit older now in the last batch, but we would typically use 9 to 11-year-old distillates, which have aged in ex-bourbon casks, which are first fill bourbon and second fill. And we also include sherry casks, whiskies, first fill and second fill sherry. And what we'll do is we'll marry them together, which we call vatting. So we'll vat those whiskies together. And when the newly arrived in Spanish Oloroso casks from the Lustau Bodega in Spain come over, in Jerez in Spain, they're fresh. They're still, wet with the wine still soaked through in the wood. So we'll fill those casks with this particular vatting, and we normally leave it for a year plus. So it could be a year and a half to even 2 years sometimes when we do a Lustau bottling. So what we're trying to do there is really, I suppose, intensify and drive up the sherry wine influence from two different angles, which is interesting. So if you've 11-year-old whiskey that's been in sherry, you're getting quite an old whiskey that's been a long time in a sherry barrel. So you get that typical dried fruit nutty character. But if you take that whiskey and put into a very fresh barrel just for a year or two, you're getting a fresh wine influence on top of that, which is more what we'd say kind of a jammy, kind of red berry compote type of character to it. So you'll find there's a huge more of a wine character, more than just the dried fruits, but a fresh wine kind of, I suppose, appeal to the Lustau. So you can see the difference there with the Redbreast 12 and the Redbreast 12 cask strength. So where the small batch fits in is we again do a vatting of whiskies, which we did this actually in 2019 in November. So we took 50 casks, which were again a mix of first fill and second fill bourbon, but also just second fill sherry. There was no first fill sherry in the original vatting. So what we did was we toned down the wine influence in the initial mix. And then when more sherry wine casks came in, which we filled then which we filled with the 50 casks, we filled 18 sherry barrels from that, but we left it just for 10 weeks as opposed to a year to 2 years. So what we were looking for really is, in wine terms, I suppose I've heard it used, but like a blush, a very small acquaintance with the sherry wine just for say 10 weeks. So you're just giving a small bit of an injection of fresh wine to it. We're not letting it overly intensify like you'd find in Lustau. And then we left it on cask strength when we bottled it at 58.7. And that's where, as I was saying with Billy describing it kind of between a Lustau and a cask strength, and as you say, like a cask strength Lustau, that's where it kind of sits in between, you could say.
That's very interesting. The 50 casks that you started with, and then, so you started with you mentioned first fill bourbon, no first fill sherry, but then you recast into, you put the vatting into 18 sherry barrels. What happened to the rest of it then? Does that then get revatted together, or how does it go from 50 to 18?
Well, interesting enough, everything that came out of the casks is what filled those 18. So when you think of the 18 casks of sherry, they're 500 litre capacity each.
Okay.
But when we're using a mix of first fill and second fill bourbon and second fill sherry, what you're doing there is those bourbon casks in the vatting are only 200 bulk litres. So you're using 50 casks, of which the majority of those barrels were just 200 litres and a small amount, 500. You have to account then for 10 years of maturation losses on top of that. So when we empty out all those 50 casks, the volume that came out of those barrels was enough to just fill 18 500 litre barrels. So there was nothing else. There was no excess that we moved into other barrels. It was literally, we empty those out. We then gauge, well, what's in the vat? There's X amount of volume. Well, that's enough to fill 18 sherry butts. And then we emptied out all those butts together and bottled it. And so it's a one-off limited edition So if we ever do it again, it's going to be a different range of casks, different sherry casks as well in the finishing, and even a different age if we wanted to. So this is kind of, I suppose, a unique offering that we haven't been asked to make a second batch anyway yet. So we can see that's a one-off for now anyway.
You see how feedback goes as to whether there's another one desired.
Exactly.
Should we taste it? I'd love you to talk us through it. We've had lots of people opening their bottles already, sharing their notes, some in the comments as well, and everyone feel free to share your notes and comments as to what you're getting. This to me is a very different Redbreast from anything else I think you've released. It just feels very, very different. But I'm not going to lead the conversation. I'll let you take over.
Well, before we came on air, I was nosing it. I actually poured 2 glasses, and I just filled one with water and left it while I was nosing the first one at cask strength. And it's very interesting because it changes a lot, A, over time, but B, when you add a bit of water as well. So on the cask strength sample that I have, for me, there was a huge burst of a sweet character, but not just the vanilla, but like sweet cherries or baked cherry, like a confectionery cherry character to it, which I find very interesting because it's kind of a small bit of that wine influence, but it's not gone to a berry or kind of jammy contribution. But I'm also getting a nice little bit of a black pepper character to it. And I was writing down here as well, even a small touch of licorice. So it's a very interesting note to it, when you're trying it at its natural strength. But the sweetness stood out for me, but not your typical, for us, oak sweetness, which is your vanilla usually, or kind of a caramelic type of note. I wasn't particularly finding that. More of a confectionery sherry, or cherry rather, type of nose to it. But as I added a bit of water and I looked at it again in the other glass, what I find is you've muted a little bit of that intensity in terms of the peppers, the black pepper type of character, but you've opened up a note that I find kind of a bit of cinnamon spice, which comes through. So what I like about it is every time you keep going back to it and nosing it, certain parts of that kind of those descriptors seem to jump out at me again, and you kind of have to dig under it to get that, hot still spice to it. So it's a very interesting drop.
Some of the feedback we got from those who've opened it was that this one was a particular one that just took time to open up, and that even an hour later in the glass, there was some great evolution of the notes coming through.
There was, and I think again because of the high strength, it's always good to leave the glass sit there for a while, particularly when it's at 58.7. Just let it breathe, let a lot of that alcohol maybe leave your glass, and you'll pick up a lot more kind of the body of the whiskey after a few minutes even. But this one now, for me, it's been out probably about half an hour now, and like a good wine, it just keeps evolving in your glass. It's very interesting.
To me, there's the unmistakable Lustau notes of I always liken Lustau to walking into a wet old cellar in the best way. There's a lovely kind of a good mustiness to a Lustau to me that I love. I love that note, and maybe that's an old sherry note, is it? It's an old European oak note.
There would be, yeah. There's an unmistakable note when you walk in a bodega, that it's old wine that has just been evaporating out, hitting the roof for centuries. And sometimes you might even get a slight kind of vinegary note from a lot of those sherry wines when they've been there in the bodega so long. So you get this kind of sharp type of acidic note sometimes, and you can kind of get that in certain whiskies as well if they're quite old sherry casks as well. So I kind of know what you mean by a kind of nostalgic notion of being in a bodega with this one. And again, it's I suppose the final few weeks or 10 weeks in sherry, you can just see how much of an impact it's made in just such a short space of time compared to a Lustau, which would be the year to 2 years normally finishing.
Is this is an Oloroso sherry cask final vatting then? Is Oloroso sherry as opposed to its first maturation, was that Oloroso sherry, or would that have been a different sherry?
No, it would have been Oloroso. Yeah, and that's the main style of sherry that we would go with for seasoning with our casks over in Spain. We would get smaller batches of other sherry casks, like, Fino being an example, but they're just still aging. We haven't really kind of worked with them yet in terms of any brand, but they're kind of one of a few different types of casks we keep in the warehouse that we kind of check from time to time. But Oloroso seems for us, it matches well best with pot still whiskey. And it works two ways really. What it does is the seasoning for the 2 years, it will actually extract a lot of those heavier wood compounds from fresh oak. So the 2 years of aging, the wine will extract heavy wood notes, but it then also stays behind as a wine character in the wood. So it's kind of works for us not only as a wine contribution, but gives us a more pleasant wood characteristic as well when we're aging the whiskey in it. So it's kind of a double effect seasoning process, really, you could say.
And fair to say that the absence of the name Listau would indicate that perhaps these casks didn't necessarily come from Bodegas Listau specifically.
Yeah, we would work with, I suppose, our main sherry cask supplier and also our main seasoning supplier would be Antonio Payet, who's in Jerez. So Antonio's father, Antonio Senior, who's now passed away a few years, but he started a vinegar business originally, and then on top of that added a cooperage and a winery. So for the last, I suppose, 35 years, Billy and others perform like Brendan Monks would have been, buying casks from Antonio Senior back in the day. And Antonio now runs the show, but he's nearing retirement. So his two sons run it. Another Antonio Jr. and Isaac, and they have a cousin, Esperanza, who works there, and her mother also called Esperanza. So not only do they make the casks for us, but they'll do most of the seasoning with their Oloroso in their bodega for us as well. But parcels of the casks that they make go to Listau for seasoning, which has always been the case, because I suppose where you require more casks than what amount of wine is produced by the Pius family. So it makes sense that years ago they approached Listau on our behalf and asked, would they mind seasoning some of our casks for us with their Listau Oloroso. So what we would do is when they come back, either from the Listau bodega or the Antonio Payet Maria bodega, we would kind of consider them all as one parcel of sherry casks coming in. But, Listau being world renowned and, a huge, I suppose, award winner for fortified wines, and, working with them for so long, we said, why don't we, acknowledge that we're working with one of the best wineries in the world. So what we do then is when those Listau casks come over, we'll parcel some of them away specifically for Listau, and then the majority or the remainder then go into the mix of first fill sherries that are coming over from Antonio's stock as well. So this could be either all Antonio's sherry casks or Listau, or a mix of both. We won't have a record of exactly which bodega this particular batch comes from, whereas with the Listau, we know it's all Listau casks.
Isn't it a lovely thing that you can trace it back to a man's name? I don't know if these would be Antonio's casks, like we all know Antonio, what an amazing thing though, like a distillery the size of Midleton, and still we get to talk like this about traceability and kind of transparency and the men and women behind it. I think that's fascinating.
Oh yeah, sure. We'd go over, obviously before all of this lockdown, but every year we'd go over and meet them still and go through what we're hoping to buy from them in years ahead. And they talk to us about, their plans of where they're getting their oak and their, sustainability, tracing for oak, because, it comes from Spain and the Iberian Peninsula, but it also sometimes might come from France or other countries in Europe. So it's all traceable. So we would do a bit of sustainability projects with them as well. So, and they're a great family, we feel like an extension to their family every time we're over, because we're having food with them and all their relatives and things. So it's a business trip, but it's just extremely enjoyable at the same time. I must say,
Next time you're talking to them, ask them will they come on the lock-in one Friday night and they can show us the winery.
They nearly have better English now than me at this stage.
Should we taste this? We could talk for 24 hours, I'd say, and we still wouldn't have sipped a drop. Take it back. Send it back. We don't want it.
We'll take it back if we don't want it, for sure.
Plenty of lads in Ireland would take it.
It's a very interesting taste, I must say. At the start, I found it a little bit dry. Again, that would allude to maybe the tannins in the Spanish casks. That this European oak has a lot more tannin structure to it than American oak, but also the higher strength. Maybe it's evaporating faster off the tongue for me. But as soon as that initial dryness waved past, a burst of kind of a creamy, luscious coating and a fruit texture, oily texture, you could say, but a fruity kind of sweetness came through as well. And even now, as I'm talking, there's even a kind of a mouth-watering sensation to it. So a very, very multi-dimensional flavor, which is actually what I'm thrilled to see in it at cask strength. It doesn't feel like it's that high, I must say, in alcohol content. Maybe initial sip where it's a bit dry, but it definitely evolves, and obviously you can feel it in the aftertaste, quite lingering, and there is a spice intensity to it, but very, very good, well-rounded, kind of good body to it, I must say.
That dryness is really competing with the pot still character of that creaminess, that spice, that dryness. I definitely get that. And it's almost like the sweetness is just kind of sitting in the third row of the movie theater. It's not quite the front row yet, and maybe it moves forward over time. I don't know, but it's kind of, the sweetness is looking to come out, but the dryness maybe wins over a bit.
Yeah, I exactly think the same. It's like as if the sweetness waits its turn. That's the more forceful, spicy character come in and wave itself around and leave, and the sweetness then comes out at the end. It's very interesting.
A lot of people getting the cherry notes on the nose. The cherry very identifiable by a lot of our group. Even comparing it to the Method and Madness cherry, the cherry cask, cherry wood, the wild cherry wood.
Yes. Yeah. No, cherry as a fruit, but definitely a sweetened cherry. I know Billy would talk about black cherries when he describes it, which you can kind of definitely see in this one, more so than the others, I must say.
Would you always recommend adding a drop of water, Dave, to the whiskies to open it up? Or because I've always found the Midleton cask strength whiskies haven't, for my palate, needed the water, but am I missing out by not adding in a few drops?
I'm going to say yes and no. Like, I'd be very slow to add water a lot of the time, especially the first few sips, I suppose. But if I just wanted to see, does the water help it or hinder it, I might add a bit of water then, because I know with some whiskies, I would never add water to, because every time I would have in the past, it just seems to fall apart. But then there's other whiskies that just a small bit of a dash of water gives it a new kind of breath of life in terms of flavor. So for me, when I say yes and no, like the way you mentioned Midleton, it really depends on the style of whiskey or the brand that you're going to consider adding the water to. For me now, I probably wouldn't add water to that one, I must say. I would just when I'm wanting to see what the water would do. But I'd probably, if it was my only glass that I had, if I wasn't lucky enough to have the bottle of it here, I would just probably leave it as it is. But when I did add a bit of water to it on the nose, I did find it kind of it waned slightly in that sweet intensity, which I liked, but a cinnamon type of note popped in to my head when I smelt it. So it does change, but for this, probably go without the water, I would say.
I'll try a drop of water in it. Billy, who's supervising from afar there, asking the question, how's the mouthfeel or the texture? He's putting us on the spot as if he doesn't already know what the mouthfeel or the texture is like in the whiskey. But I mean, from my perspective anyway, I'm getting a lovely tingly pepper spice on the gums and the tongue, and there is an unmistakable creaminess, but there's a little hint of it up front, but then it takes a step back to the dryness, and then maybe it creeps back again. It's different. There's a different mouthfeel to this than the other Redbreasts.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. When you compare it to, again, the 12, for me, the 12 has a little bit of that dry character, but definitely more of a creamy mouth coating texture with an extra element of what you might find as a nutty almond or marzipan type note and dried fruits like raisins. I'm not particularly getting that in this particular offering. It's more, as you said, a little bit more spicy, peppery, dry on the initial taste, but the sweet comes in slowly and that creaminess definitely creeps in, but it's not as initially noticeable as it would be on the Redbreast 12.
Yeah, it is so layered, and so it just evolves slowly, very slowly. And I see some people in the comments have said it's taken them half an hour, 40 minutes, and then it's coming to all its glory, which makes for a good plan for what you're going to do with 40 minutes, I suppose. Is just wait and watch it evolve, and expose itself over time.
The aftertaste, I must say, when you're after drinking and you're breathing, even the what they say retro kind of taste definitely evolves in the aftertaste, which is very interesting as well.
Very different to the cask strength, the regular 12-year-old cask strength. You mentioned, so sitting lovely between Redbreast Listowel, Redbreast 12 cask strength. The last Redbreast small batches you released in the US they were an age statement. They were marked with 14 years. This now would be the second non-age statement in the Redbreast lineup. So Listowel, and now this, which is not unlike a Listowel for my money. I'm going to call it Listowel on steroids, without the involvement of the Listowel family, perhaps. But is there 9 years in bourbon and sherry, and then a final 10 weeks in the revatted? Is a non-age statement something that Redbreast might do more of going forwards? Is there a reason for it? Is there a reason why you wouldn't have an age statement, I wonder?
No, not really, in the sense of we don't really feel we either have to make a non-age statement Redbreast or that we have to. It's just what style of, I suppose, flavor are we going for, and what volume are we looking at doing? And with all those considered, if we put this type of prototype together and it's 9-10 years of age, which is kind of where Listowel fits, is there a need to call out an age on it? Whereas if we're doing something like 27, that was a milestone of an age that it's something you would definitely want to highlight and celebrate. So it's not at the forefront of our mind when we're looking at new styles of Redbreast, whether it needs to be an age statement or not. It's more about, we would liaise with marketing and they'd say, look, we're looking for a new edition of a small batch for the US, something that's just, part of the core expressions in terms of flavor maybe, and it won't be too big a volume. What do you think? And we'd say, well, we can do this, that, or the other. And the age never really comes into it at that stage at all in terms of label or anything. So, when you see, I suppose, in the world of whiskey that age statements have dwindled over time, where a lot of brands have gone from having age statements to none. We're kind of middling in that area, I think, because we launch nearly as many age statements as many as we don't at the same time. So it's not a priority for us whether to have it or not at all.
That makes sense. It's always a question, isn't it? If you've had age statements for so long, as soon as you don't have an age statement, people are freaking out. What's happening now? Am I going to lose my age statements? And I'd assume this isn't designed to push any age statement off the shelf, but rather find its own place.
Exactly. Age isn't everything on a label. It's, as people say, it's not about age, it's about maturity. So I think age is great if you have it to show, but sometimes it can hinder you, because if you feel obliged that you have to do an age statement, what you're doing is you're actually cornering yourself with what stock you have, which won't allow you to create a certain flavor that you might be necessarily looking for. Because if it needs to be over 15 or needs to be over 21, there's a lot of whiskies that wouldn't meet that criteria, but they have the optimum flavor coming from them, which you would love to have in your particular brand. So if you're saying, well, it must be of a certain age, you're definitely putting yourself in a corner from a choice of flavor, so to speak. It's like, I don't know, painting. If you have lots of different colors on your palette, but they say you can only use this, and this, then there's only so many variations you can do with those, but if it's a bit looser from an age point of view, it gives you more option to express flavors using quite a young age with an old age, and that'll give you a flavor you wouldn't have seen in some other brands as well.
One of the recent releases, Blue Spot, outside the Redbreast range, obviously, that was an interesting study in the stories behind, or the approach to age statements and non-age statements, where you have a 7-year-old by age statement, yet you have 19, 20-year-old whiskey components in there. So it can be,
yes.
There's pros and cons to the age statement, isn't there?
Exactly. When you see a 7-year-old whiskey label, it might put a few people off, but again, the minimum age on a label doesn't tell you everything. As you rightly pointed out, that we've some Madeira casks in there that are in their 20s, so it just shows the wide spectrum of age in the blend, even though people will just see the 7 on the label itself.
I know. Lots of questions about the number of bottles that have made it to the US. We talked before we went live, and we don't have the exact number, but I think there's a very easy way to work that out through triangulation and looking at your labels. But Dave mentioned 18 casks that are the 500-litre butts. So, if they were full, you'd have 9,000 litres and divide that by your 750 mils approximately. But I've got bottle number 11,909. So I'm going to assume I didn't get the last one. So there's probably about at least 12,000, and maybe some of you have more than that. We can see if we can find out the exact number, but that's a much bigger release than I think the 2,500 bottles or so from 2019, which is great.
Yeah, the 2019 offerings was kind of more in line with equivalence of like a single cask in terms of volume, because when we made the 4 batches, A, B, C, and D, when we made batch A, we put it back into bourbon casks, and we made batch B back into bourbon C and D. So when we went to the States, and people on the ground would have met with liquor stores who were interested in buying either A, B, C, or D, what they would say is, I'll buy batch A, but they would get one of the barrels basically from that batting. So the volumes would have been very small then, kind of the equivalent of a single cask. So if they bought two casks worth of batch A, that's very small compared to what we did for this particular offering.
Obviously, the phrase small batch has no legal definition, and it's open to interpretation, distillery to distillery. 18 casks seems to be small batch enough, doesn't it, compared to what you're doing on a grander scale? Yeah,
it's a drop in the ocean in terms of what's on site aging. We probably have 18 barrels more a day evaporating into the atmosphere, just for the Angel share than what we launched here, which is frightening when you think about it.
Loads of questions coming in, and this is still evolving for me. I added a few drops of water, and it is changing. There's a lovely, in Ireland we'd call it like a sucky sweet, a hard sweet, a boiled sweet characteristic, a kind of a candy that shines through with a kind of a pepper coating.
Yeah, even a kind of almost a little touch of citrus without the water, when it tastes like a barley sugar sweet. If like a hard-boiled confectionery sweet note, as you're saying. That's what I was thinking of earlier as well, actually.
Yeah, a sucky sweet. Let me see. Ed is wondering. He says strong case for non-age statement. Would still like to know what are the range of ages in this stuff. How dare you desecrate this bottle by calling it this stuff? Ed, it's greater than this stuff, but in any case, your question remains.
Yeah. Well, it was a mix of whiskies from 2009 and 2010 in terms of the year they were distilled and laid down in cask. So when we emptied them out in November 2019, the typical age calculated out at about 9.9 years, thereabouts. So it's almost a 10-year aged expression, which is kind of where we would typically try to aim for with the likes of Lestau. So it's, again, trying to match the existing offerings that we have, the existing styles of Redbreast, but then do something different with it at the same time. So it's almost thereabouts 10 years of age, and then another 10 weeks of aging on top of that in the sherry. Okay,
very good. Let me see, there was a question here. Yes, regarding so this has the batch 119 designation on it, similar to the Redbreast 12 cask strength, and also Redbreast 27-year-old, so batched whiskies would that indicate that there would be a batch 120, or is there any news on what that might indicate down the line?
That's a very good question, because when I saw B119, I wasn't sure, is it actually a mistake or not, because I think where it might have gone wrong is because we emptied out the casks in 2019, all the label design and everything might have been done then, so it probably should have actually, I'm guessing now, and if there's anyone from our marketing team watching, they can correct me, but it probably should have been B120, and just saying it's batch 1 in 2020 when we bottled it, even though it wasn't released because of everything going on. It was delayed, obviously, as well. So I suppose that would allude to the idea of maybe doing a second batch, the way we do with the cask strength Redbreast, but no one has asked us to do a second batch. No one has said the plan is to do 2, 3, and 4 batches or anything like that. It was just do a one-off batch, but maybe they want to leave it open to interpretation as to whether we'd ever do something again like this. But for now, it's the one-off that, for as far as we're aware, we won't be doing a second batch.
I think I speak for all of the audience when I say I am now officially requesting a second batch, and if you could put the words stories and sips on the bottom of the label, that'd be brilliant. But maybe just bigger than the words Redbreast, just above Redbreast, like, if you wouldn't mind, that'd be a great batch. It's interesting, you talk about not being asked to do it yet. You have there's this lovely, or I'm sure it's not lovely sometimes, but this meeting of blenders, financiers, and marketers, all having to come together to figure out what gets released, and everyone has a different goal, I'd imagine, and you're somehow having to come to some agreement as to what eventually will be released. The higher the cask strength, the more it's going to cost in taxes, etc. And I'm wondering, how much say do you get to have from the blending perspective on what should be released?
I suppose we're very fortunate that we would have obviously a very good say in what we make, but it depends on what the objective of why you're releasing a particular whiskey at, a certain market, a certain type of consumer, or ultimately, when it boils down to money, at what price point is it going to be sold at. So when those factors come into it, we'd end up kind of working with the marketing and finance team, and we'd kind of get essentially a brief from them. So they would say, okay, well, for this offering of the USA batch, it's to be X amount of case equivalents in terms of volume. The price we're hoping to sell it for is X amount of dollars, which then means, okay, well, that shows the price point there will dictate almost what age range you can nearly draw from, or sometimes it might just say, look, you can go wild with it if you want in terms of the age, but it's going to be sold at this point. So it depends on, does it have to be sold at that price point from an economic point of view, or is it that just there's a gap in the market for us to put a whiskey in there at that price point? So if it's the first option, then we'd have to work around the cost of whiskies that would be used to make it. So you would say, okay, well, we can't use exceptionally old whiskies that would cost a lot more in the say the manufacturing cost for a particular brand, because if the whiskey's only $50, we won't put a 50-year-old whiskey in it, essentially. But if it's a whiskey that's going to be a bit more, in price point, you can play around with more expensive whiskies. And when I say expensive, what I mean is that every whiskey in a warehouse has a cost of make. So the longer it's in a warehouse, that absorbs how much the cost of building the warehouse was in the first place. We call it maturing and minding costs. So a whiskey it's like renting, or staying in a hotel. The more days it's staying, the more it has to pay, and the more it costs, essentially. So that will be a factor. But it's not as strict as we can't do what we'd like to do when making certain brands, but we have to obviously bear those kind of variables in mind ourselves when we're making a whiskey. So what we would do is we would say, this is what we're planning to do. We'll make prototypes. So that involves going to the guys who work in the warehousing and say, look, could you give us 50 samples from those 50 casks there, 30 samples from those, and 10 from them and 5 from those. So what we'll do in the lab then is make little prototypes of what the formulation could be in terms of percentages, make different styles, look at them, talk about them, maybe bringing other people from the lab just to say, what do you think of those, or whatever. The likes of maybe Kevin O'Gorman, our head distiller, and Catherine, another distiller of ours who works with Kevin. So just to get a feel for, do they think it's within the Redbreast style, etc. And then what we'll do is we'll pick which we think are the best options out of those, send them to the guys in marketing and say, look, we're very happy with these. See what you think. If you're happy, let us know, and we'll tell you what our favorite one is, and maybe go with that. But we'll have calculated, A, can we make that to the volume they're looking for? And B, if it's a one-off, at least we can be a bit more flexible to use stuff that we don't have much of. But if it's going to be an ongoing edition, we have to think about that then as well, because we have to make sure we can make it again and again. So what's the continuity of our supply of those particular casks? So all different ways of looking at it, I suppose.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I'm sure whatever spreadsheets we all work with on a day-to-day basis in our own lines of work, yours are far bigger and far more complex. And one formula error and supply is ruined for the next 60 years for us.
Pretty much.
Billy says that accountants won't make good blenders. That comes from a lapsed accountant. Former accountant Billy Lighton has weighed in on that.
That's right. Absolutely,
Moving, on from the this fortified wine, the sherry as being the fortified wine kind of component here in terms of the casks. You've moved into port a little bit over the last 2 years. Some of the greatest whiskies I've ever tried: Whiskey Exchange 30-year-old, the Redbreast 27, the Dream Cask 28-year-old. Stunning whiskies with a port age component. Would there be perhaps a scenario where you might use whiskey that has matured in alternative types of fortified wine casks in the future for a Redbreast release?
Very good question. When we look at Redbreast as a style, we say fortified wine casks kind of quite freely with it, but it's usually confined to sherry, and only recently, as you point out as well, port. So we're a bit kind of, I suppose, slow to go too far outside of those realms at the moment in the current expressions that we do. But it's always in the back of our mind, with other editions of Redbreast, what else could we experiment with without offending any Redbreast drinkers, So we do have other casks in warehouse now from Portugal. That would be, Ruby Port, There could be Tawny Port, Fino sherries, the Oloroso sherries, things like that. That there's a wide, I suppose, not a wide, but there's a varied range of casks that we have on site that currently have no home in terms of a brand to be used. So we're always tinkering around with talking about different options, making little, prototypes again and expressions, and just keeping them in mind and seeing how they're aging over time. So if we ever get the idea of creating another edition of Redbreast, would we look at them? Or, not to forget the influence of the American oak as well in Redbreast, because in numbers, the bourbon casks in a formulation for the Redbreast range is generally the majority of casks in the mix, but it's still kind of the influence of the sherry cask or fortified wine cask that I suppose tops the flavor off, really, you'd say. Yeah. So, it'd be a shame not to call out bourbon to a degree as well. So I'd be afraid to veer too far one way in wine casks without maybe paying homage to the bourbon influence, which we don't really call out as much in sherry. But going back to your question on fortified wine, yeah, we have a few different things in warehouse now, but it's just a matter of seeing are they the right fit from a flavor profile point of view for Redbreast.
Just saying that like a 30-year-old Madeira cask would make for a lovely Redbreast component. And I know some of that Madeira is getting used up in Blue Spot, which is great, but you have some great things hidden away in warehouses there, like that none of us know about. Yeah. I was trying to figure out how to ask this question in a way that wasn't obvious, but if you were in 12 months' time, if we were sitting here, would the Redbreast range look different in 12 months' time than it would if you're sitting here now?
Yeah, you throw very easy questions at me, Barry. I must say it's great. Well, I can definitely say yes, because we'll have another Dream Cask coming out later this year. So that's a quick get out of jail card for me to say there will be a change in the Redbreast range from that point of view. But as you alluded to earlier, with an increase in, I suppose, popularity, particularly in the States, with terms of sales increasing, there's a big demand now and a big push on Redbreast as the brands we have and that we're focusing on. And when it comes to increasing the awareness and the word of mouth about a brand, obviously making different iterations of it frequently helps that word, stay kind of, I suppose, out there in the mainstream world, as opposed to just falling to the wayside without new, I suppose, variations coming out. So there probably will in the next 12 months, but everything, as you know, has slowed down in terms of launches given the world we're living in now. So we might have plans for different things, but whether they'll roll out in the next 12 months, that remains to be seen. But in terms of the Dream Cask, that's due to come out as planned. Fingers crossed.
We look forward to that coming out, and the mad rush of climbing over children and people to get to be able to buy it, and crawling over broken glass. A few of the questions that we got over the course of the evening were related to availability in different markets and why something like this might not be available globally. I think you've addressed it somewhat in terms of talking about what spirit, what whiskey you have available and stocks you have available. But I'd imagine there's also that piece of, well, we've got a burgeoning US market that might need a little hat tip, where we can reward the loyal kind of Redbreast drinkers there too. And would that play a role in where things get allocated?
It would play a big role, particularly for this batch, because it is exclusive to the States. And it just shows how important the US market is and US consumers with, I suppose, spreading the good word of Redbreast. We're not really seeing that as big in other parts of the world. If we did, I'm sure we would be kind of making one-off exclusives for them as a thank you for that. But it seems to be America where the real driving force for Redbreast is coming from. And no better way to kind of keep that momentum going is to create unique expressions just for the American market and the American consumers. So it's a nice kind of, as you said, kind of tip of the hat just to say, I suppose, thank you from the American market for keeping us busy and keeping the Redbreast train moving as well.
I've never seen such interest in Redbreast as I have the last few months. It's just blown up, and that's why I was so keen to get a chat here to talk about this, because there's so many questions being asked, and people want to know every detail, every aspect. They find Redbreast so fascinating, and we didn't even touch on any of the history of the brand, and that's a whole other discussion. But this is not a brand that was dreamed up in a marketing agency or in Madison Avenue. This is a long and storied brand, and it's amazing that 100 years later, it's now really just coming into its own, and I'd say only getting started as a lineup of whiskies.
Yeah, and that's something we're very mindful of, is the history of the brand, and that's why when you're asking about different cask types or what else could be done, we're kind of a bit slow to change too fast with it, because it's been around so long that we don't want to really move away wholeheartedly from the origins of where it comes from. So playing with fortified wine casks makes perfect sense for this type of whiskey, because that's where it originated from back in the days of the Gilbeys up in Dublin, with wine casks that they were then aging their whiskey with from the Bow Street Distillery. So it's a brand that has a huge amount of legacy. A lot of generations before me and before Billy have been involved in making it. So we're only holding the torch for now before passing on to someone else. So we want to keep it consistent to the history as much as we can, and relevant, I suppose you could say, as well.
Might there be the opportunity for us to, if we were to be blessed twice, once we had this release, this Whiskey Exchange 30-year-old port cask, it just sold out today, I think, on the Whiskey Exchange, and we counted more than 60 bottles went to our Facebook group, our Facebook community in the US, which is incredible, and they're looking for more. But when it first was released, my first reaction was, what a gift to us that we get to experience a whiskey of that age, of that caliber. Can there be more like that? Like, in the future, could we see things of that age, that quality coming out, being released, whether they're single cask or a broader release?
I'd like to say yes, in the sense that, when we come across, like we have warehouse upon warehouse of stock, which we do, a drop in the ocean is what's left to that age. So it's more likely that you'll see probably more single casks of that age rather than ongoing additions and brands. There is exceptions, obviously, when you look at Redbreast 27, there's over 32, 33-year-old whiskey in that makeup. So, we do have stock of that, but it's very small, and we need to manage that and kind of worry about it to a degree. So we will be able to bring out little single casks here and there, but a steady supply is something that'll be hard to maintain if we don't kind of keep it under control to some degree. But it's not all gone. I can put it that way, I suppose.
That's good enough. That's as good as we can expect. I think we have got through most of the questions. There's been so many coming in. It's been tough to keep up with all of them. But I think we have answered them all. Dave, you've been so generous with your time, and tasting this together has been a highlight for me of 2021 so far. In a year where we're all trying to find ways to connect in different ways. I'd much rather we were all doing this in the distillery, but maybe we'll yet do that this year. Fingers crossed. Whiskey is still evolving. It's still changing in the glass. I'm going to take my time with this. And that's great. I mean, look, it's a small batch. There's only about 12,000 plus bottles out there. I think this will go quickly. It flew off the shelves in Ohio. There's a few more cases coming to Ohio. I'll be sending those of you who are in Ohio an email shortly. There's a few more landing. But for the rest of you, I think in the West Coast is still to get some, but it's on the way. I don't think it'll last long, but it's a lovely, rare addition to the lineup, and one I'll try and pick up another bottle of. But yeah, this has been amazing. Like, thanks so much. And the fact you came live from the distillery, an added bonus. I think you wanted to be there anyway. So, but in any case, it was great to see you, Dave. So, and thanks to Billy for joining you as well. So, is there any parting words for us, Dave? Or sometimes people ask for a song from our guests, but I don't know. Are you in the mood for a song? Maybe not. I'm not putting you on the spot.
I'd love to, but I'm sure security would see the window with my vocal cords and call security. So call fire brigade. So unfortunately, I have to decline that. But maybe some other day, maybe.
I still have memories of a taxi across Boston at the Owl Triangle being belted out at a very high decibel level. That'll do us for a while.
Yeah, that's a memory we'll have for a long time, I think, back in Boston that time.
Well, Dave, listen, thanks a million. I really appreciate it. We'll let you get back to a night's sleep, and we'll keep talking about Redbreast, and really want to pass on my thanks from the group who've really enjoyed the night, and a great way to break up the week for us. And thanks to Billy for tuning in as well. And so I'll just say sláinte to everyone for tuning in. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday. We've had a great time, and hopefully we get to do some more of these in the future. So we will end the stream now. Sláinte, everybody. We'll see you in the Facebook group.
Thank you.
Sláinte, Dave.